On most weekdays, the city of Hamilton swells to about 15,000 people, working residents of Bermuda that fill the capital streets. Fortunately for you, there's plenty to explore while the rest of the island punches in. The city is small and easy to navigate by foot, which means you could spend your day marveling at the hidden gems of Hamilton. Joining me is Tim Rogers, a local historian who's been giving tours of Bermuda and the city of Hamilton for more than a decade. Tim, tell us where we are right now.
Well, this is Parleyville Park, David, and 100 years ago this wasn't even in the city, hence the name Parleyville. 200 years ago a French family moved down to Bermuda via New York. They built the house that stands inside the park, now a historical museum. And to paint a picture, I mean, this would have been a cedar forest before Hamilton came about as a city. And then this guy, William Perrott, he turned it into a citrus orchard, and this was a commercial orchard, and so New Yorkers, Torontonians, everybody would be able to buy the famous Bermuda citrus. He was also postmaster of Bermuda, but the park definitely looks very different today. It's filled with all sorts of exotic plants, just fascinating plants to look at. It's like a mini botanical gardens, and lots of sculpture as well, which is really cool to see and cool to look at.
Wow, it seems like a wonderful place just to sit and eat your lunch, maybe write a postcard. Speaking of which, I've got one that I need to send back home. Is there a post office around that I could probably stick this in the box?
You're right in the perfect spot. It's just around the corner. I can take you right to it.
Shall we?
Okay. Well, here we are, David. This is the home of the famous Bermuda postage stamp issued in 1848, the Perrott Post Office. Let's go inside.
Thanks a lot. So how old is that tree?
Well, that was planted as a 2-foot-tall sapling by William Bennett in 1848. Hard to figure that it's grown to that size now.
So this looks like an interesting statue. What are we looking at here?
Well, David, it's a part of recent Bermuda history. 50 years ago, it's hard to imagine, but black Bermudians were not allowed to go to the same movie theaters, bars or hotels as whites or white Bermudians. There was a movie theater very close to here, and the sculpture represents people holding placards because they were boycotting the segregation of the movie theaters. And within a matter of months, in 1959, blacks could go into the same movie theaters, restaurants and bars. When Voices Rise is the statue title, and unveiled 2 years ago.
So this is a pretty impressive building.
It is, isn't it, David? You're pretty much in the center of the city. It is the City Hall, and its architecture is kind of interesting. A local guy by the name of Will Onions studied in Europe, and he really got the City Hall in Stockholm, Sweden, where they do the Nobel Prizes. And so he starred this building, which is just over 50 years old, on that.
So what can folks expect to see when they go inside?
Well, first of all, David, you've got 2 art galleries. The National Gallery of Art, which has a permanent collection of works done of Bermuda by visitors and locals.
Okay.
And then an ever-changing exhibit, which is kind of cool, gives some freshness to it. And then you've got the Bermuda Society of Arts. So these are local artists who are struggling to make their way in the art world. In the foyer of the City Hall, you've got pictures of the various mayors of Hamilton going back to its origins 2 centuries ago. You've got a portrait of the Queen, which is kind of fun to look at. And then at various times of years, the City Hall is also home to theatre and music groups, concerts and magic shows. This is George Somers Tucker, one of our early mayors of Hamilton. And his daughter in the 1930s provided nearly £40,000 as seed money to build this City Hall. So she never got to see it actually happen, but since all of these portraits were done posthumously, the surviving family were given permission to have a portrait larger than life, whereas you notice everybody else, it's a head and shoulders only.
So these are all different mayors of Hamilton?
The right worshipful mayors, absolutely, yes, from the oldest through to the most recent. Well, this was done just over 20 years ago, David. Portrait, obviously, of Her Majesty the Queen, and She didn't actually do a sitting for this one, so it's done from photo images, photo archives, postcards. And I think it has to be said that the skin tones are a little bit odd. And there's a funny story that goes along with it, that when the Queen's come to Bermuda, they've actually taken the portrait down and tucked it away so that she doesn't see her somewhat jaundiced flesh. Well, incidentally, David, this is the public bus terminal, and buses leave from here to go to St George at the east end and Dockyard at the west. It's a regular service and it's very affordable.
How much does it cost?
You're looking at $4 for a journey from one end of the island to the other. Or you can buy day passes or week passes, making it even cheaper.
Oh, that's not bad at all.
Not bad at all.
So we've only walked a few steps from City Hall and we've come upon this magnificent structure behind us. Tell me about this church.
Well, we are on Church Street, David, which is easy to remember, and it's actually our Anglican cathedral. It's just over 100 years old, and yet its architecture looks very different from that. It's built of local limestone rock, but because they started on a French cathedral, the yellow stone around the windows, sandstone, is actually from France. One of the lesser known tourist attractions with the cathedral is to climb the tower. It's a lot of steps,
wow.
But you get some awesome views over the city.
Where are they from?
Well, they're from Scotland, David. It's called Peterhead Red Granite, and you see a lot of cathedrals and churches in the West Indies making use of them because they're strong, robust in a hurricane zone.
So all these wooden pews are gorgeous. They must be Bermuda cedar?
Actually, David, they're not. It's Indiana pine, and no real significance except it was plentiful and it was cheap. The choir pews, however, they're made of English oak.
Really?
That would seem to be the right thing to do in an English colony like Bermuda. But we've had some Bermuda cedar incorporated into the cathedral. And if you look up into the roof space, it really does look like the upturned ship's keel.
It does.
So typical of early European cathedrals, and that is made out of Bermuda cedar.
Wow, it's unbelievable the amount of craftsmanship that has gone into this cathedral.
It really is, and when you consider it was constructed in 30 years compared to many cathedrals in Europe that took generations and generations of people to construct.
So this looks like an interesting building. Is that Italian terracotta?
It is, David, absolutely. Yeah, the building is the Houses of Parliament, so it's where matters of state are decided for Bermuda. The building's older, but the facade with the terracotta was added on 130 years ago. And at that point, Queen Victoria had celebrated 50 years on the throne. And so they decided to embellish the building with the terracotta facade, something that her and her husband really liked. And upstairs is where our Parliament meets, and so it's the power base of Bermuda, if you will.
Interesting, and now Parliament gets together about once a week, is that right?
That's right, just on Fridays typically, and so visitors can go into the house and they can see Parliament happening. They can sit down and watch and listen to the debates.
So in addition to catching the parliamentary action inside, folks could really get a stunning view of Hamilton Harbor right from this hill.
Absolutely, it's another good reason to come up to this spot to get that great panorama.
Now I hear there's some significance to this clock tower up here.
Well, believe you me, David, if I need to check my watch, it's one of the more accurate clocks in the city and definitely worth keeping an eye on.
So if I wanted to catch the 2 o'clock bus and set my watch by something, that's the clock I should be looking at.
It's the one I'd use, David.
Fantastic.
Well, here we are, David, at the Cabinet Building. Cabinet Building is where our Senate meets, and so it's the upper house of Parliament. Inside the building, we've got the Senate Chamber, which is really cool. Visitors can go in and see that. And the Premier has her office inside of there as well.
That's the leader of Bermuda.
That's correct, just like a Prime Minister or a President. The building dates back to the 1830s, so it's certainly got some age to it, and well worth having a look inside.
So it looks like there's quite a few historical monuments and statues here in the lawn. Do they have any special significance?
Yes, they do. We have a cenotaph, and so that's our war memorial. It's an exact copy of the one in London. And then we have a statue of a lady being burnt at the stake.
Oh my goodness.
And you might imagine there's a story connected with that. I think we should go over and have a look.
So who was Sally Bassett, and what does this statue depict?
Well, Sally Bassett was a black slave, 1730, and living on an estate in Southampton. And what she'd learned is that the government of Bermuda was trying to free blacks. And so if your master died, you might end up being free. So she worked out that maybe she could kill off her master. And so she took some poison and she gave it to her master. She gave poison to her daughter and granddaughter on other estates. Unfortunately, her granddaughter couldn't watch the young children that she was in charge of get sick, and so she turned her grandmother in. And the people of Bermuda, the government, decided to take matters into their own hands to make an example of Sally, and much in the way of witchcraft, to burn her at the stake. And so that's what this statue represents. It was done by a black Bermudian artist, and it was unveiled in 2009, and another great reason to pop down to the Cabinet Building grounds.
So the city of Hamilton really must have changed a lot throughout the years.
Well, I guess it's kind of inevitable. It's 200 years old, and so that's absolutely true. It has changed a lot, but Front Street is where it all began. And in fact, the houses, buildings across the street here haven't really changed that much in 200 years. They'd be used as warehousing for the storage of goods people would bring in from around the globe. And then the folks would live upstairs. And today it's home to some of the finest retail stores that Hamilton has to offer.
Tim, that was absolutely fantastic. Thanks so much for your time. It was truly a fascinating walk around Hamilton. Just have one last question. I've worked up quite a bit of an appetite. Do you have any recommendations for a great place to get a bite?
Well, I would recommend the beach, but the beach Front Street, that is, and it's just down the street on the corner of Front and Parliament.
Fantastic. I think I'm going to get a bite.
Enjoy.
Thanks.